Hey everyone, Brian here with Fools and Sages. Just a quick introduction. Uh, this episode, we start talking about organizations as living systems, and being made up of humans. We sort of discuss them as systems of passing and communicating meaning, and we start to unfold that. If you're a longtime listener of Fools and Sages, you'll know that we talk often about the idea of a cognitive model. Okay, if we look at things naively, we might come to the idea that, we're discrete objects and we move in a world of discrete objects, and that we kind of exist in a purely 3D kind of a world. But what we come to understand, what some philosophers have pointed out, is that we actually live and occupy a world made up of meaning. So for example, when I look across the room, I see technically a brown square, but I don't really see the brown square. I see the door that actually is that brown square, right? See how already we've slipped from the physical thing to what it means. And as a painter, for example, this becomes a problem. When a painter tries to paint a tree, what you find out is that what you tend to paint is what you think a tree looks like, instead of actually looking and seeing what the tree looks like. So anyway, we have this idea of a cognitive model, or sometimes we've referred to this as our idea or picture of life, the world, the universe, and everything, and that it contains our understanding of relationships. We build our expectations out of it, and it's actually sort of sits between us and the world of pure perception without meaning. So I've sort of made reference to this world of meaning, like a big map of London. In London, they have this thing where the cabbies, before they can become a cabbie and get their green card, they have to pass a test. And the test they call the knowledge. They have to be able to get from anywhere to anywhere. And they say that it takes 3 or 4 years of serious study to learn the knowledge, and that the average cabbie takes 12 attempts before he passed the test. So I kind of think about it like that, except it's got even more dimensions than than the dimensions of the town of London, because it has all these relationships and it has all the values and all the stories that sit behind it. And we sort of live and occupy that cognitive model. So you may think about it like, if it was the map of London, we live in a certain place and we go to school or we go to work or we go to the store at certain places. And those places we're really familiar with within our cognitive model of, metaphorical London. But a cabbie has to know the whole town. And for our purposes, for philosophical purposes, we need to know the whole town too of our cognitive model. That is, our world wants to map in more ways than maybe just our normal pathway from home to work. Some famous philosophers like Schopenhauer said we're sleepwalking and we need a shock to wake us up. Well, part of the component of that sleepwalking is this idea that we only ever travel the same paths cognitively. So what we try to unfold in this episode is, how do we break some of those patterns? How do we reveal them to ourselves? Mostly these show up as narratives, things that we may live out of without even being conscious of. And so how do we work with those? We also look at something that's there in every conversation we have, and it may technically be there even when we're alone, but nobody ever talks about it. And we're going to talk about it, and we're going to point to it and show how you actually get empowered by understanding and seeing that it's there. So I think that's about half the time I usually spend in an introduction. So uh, enjoy. Can philosophy repair the world, shaking off the still life?
I had an experience recently that I have questions about. Um, I think I'm part of a dialogue group, and we practice, every couple months, sometimes a little more frequently. And this is practicing poem dialogue. And it's common to sort of seed the dialogue with a question that everybody answers individually, and then the dialogue starts. And so what everyone said at the start kind of like creates the field that the dialogue is generated in. And the question at a recent dialogue was, what is a narrative that you see yourself living today? And what is a question that you have about that? And everybody went around and kind of shared their narratives. And then the dialogue itself was richer than usual. And it made me think about the a number of things. One is like in the moment, like calling for self-awareness and seeing everybody sort of get vulnerable and have to share something vulnerable and introspective, um, probably contributed to just like the empathy level or the compassion level, going on in the space. So that's sort of interesting. But I've been trying to think about, well, the narratives themselves were connecting people in that moment to sort of archetypal trajectories. Like all the narratives basically could be found in seasons of a man's life or in um y- you know some stages of development, maybe that's more involved than seasons, like the enneagram and how it talks about for every type there's a way we see the world when we're in development. There's a way we see the world when we're regressing. There's a way we see the world when we're under stress. There's a, so all of those ways we see the world are kind of archetypal narratives that together form a, let's say, virtually complete cognitive model, maybe.
That fall out of the dimensions of possibility in an almost geometric way.
Yeah. And there's a hierarchy to these narratives also, which is maybe another interesting thread there. Like, you know, to be in a narrative where we see ourselves as a victim is different hierarchically, I'll say, than being in a narrative in which we see ourselves as interconnected with all things, right? Um, and I don't mean we're telling ourselves to see things that way. I mean, that's actually the reality that we're living. And so, the so I was trying to think categorically of like, well, what other question could seed a dialogue in a similar way that evoked both the vulnerability and introspection and kind of pointed to this unconscious universe, in which we're creating meaning so that the dialogue would kind of replicate that experience. And so that got me thinking also about rituals in general and the table setting that happens as part of ceremony, ayahuasca ceremony, but ceremony in general. There's like a setting things up to create a field in which meaning can emerge writ large. And so, kind of these topics of narrative, archetype, creating an environment for meaning to emerge more fundamentally and collective meaning to emerge with a higher probability. Like, yeah, how might I think about this experience in terms of being able to replicate it or in terms of understanding as fully as possible what might have happened?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a few things. Um, y- there is always the tendency to see the obvious and to miss the negative space. So we might come at that question saying, "What do we do?" uh, which is an inactive presumption of an activity. What do we do to create a certain circumstance? And what I have found in the speaking and the listening and all of that is that we tend to see and look at the speaking, but after years of involving yourself in that, you start to realize that there is a listening, and the listening is a lot harder to identify because it's quiet. It is tied to that idea of narratives that we all carry as well in a bank shot kind of a way. But the real point is that what I have found in the way of a ceremony where and I'm a great believer that the mind has there's certain things we're aware of and we know that we can't flatten out into words necessarily. But that basically, like in a ceremony, you don't go and say, okay, I want to have this outcome, so I'm going to do this. I mean, it might look like that. But if you drill into it, you'll see that the this that you're going to do is actually not as much of a doing as going, what? Which, I've referred to this as, I've referred to ceremonies as having the golf clubs jump out of the bag for you. So you don't need to pick the club. The club knows which club you need and it jumps out of the bag. Well, I guess I'm pointing at the mind condition, the dispositional mental state that is opened enough that it can respond to the listening that is already there. So what all that would distill to is to say that given any group of people, there might be a set of questions or a way to approach it that's likely to be unique in each case. And so the way that I, as a pragmatic, functionalist kind of a viewpoint would go about that would be to try to be in that setting and then enter that disposition wherein I can respond to the listening that is there, which is, I think, what a therapist tries to do. And you have theories about what you're trying to do with that. But I think as a young therapist, you hang on to those, and as an older, a more experienced person where you've seen so many different ways the ball comes off the bat, more of it comes from the seat of your pants. Uh, when Krishna and us were talking, and we were talking about uh, the nature of truth and how you might answer the same question differently based on who's asking it because it's contextualized. When a 20-year-old asks you a question, you respond in a way that might be different than to a 35-year-old because of that chapter thing. It's not that the truth has changed, it's that the relevance of that truth is different from a different seat. So what you're really talking about, is a kind of a group therapy, would be the way I would tend to read it. And, uh, when when we were trying to do a similar thing like that at St. John's, we would always start with a question, and everyone was kind of expected to have something to contribute to the conversation, but it wasn't in a, "Okay, everybody give us what you got on the table, and then we'll go from there," which is a lot more like a jury, actually. A lot of juries start out with, "Well, let's take a vote and see where everybody's at first, and then we'll hammer it out from there." Uh, but but I think in general, this idea of it's this impulse that I often identify to thingify, where we thingify the speaking and we lose its relationship to the listening, which contextualizes the speaking. Like if you don't hear the listening, you can't really understand the speaking. Uh, It's one of the problems I'm having with Heidegger is that a lot of it's translated out of German. My German is remedial. And so you miss cognates because they're cognated in one language and they're not cognated in English. And so he's speaking to a listening that I know I don't share. And again, this is the hermeneutical problem, right? The interpretive problem. Um, so so yeah, there's some kind of a feedback, and this is where it does almost become shamanism because I think there is a different state. I don't think it's good to necessarily have a thoroughly fleshed out intellectual outline. Like I was told once by some Werner Erhard people that one of the things that he used to do is they've got all these people and they paid all this money and they've rented this hotel room and they're all there and they're expecting this transformative experience. And I mean, 500 at a time. And they've got all their notes about how they're going to do this and they've done it before, but they have their outlines and everything. And and Werner comes in 3 minutes before they're supposed to go launch. And he gathers up all the notes, throws them in a trash can, sets them on fire, tells them all, I don't know what you're going to do, but you can't do that. Right? You can't follow it because it's on fire. Very similar to a story of the transmission between two Zen masters, where the one master is trying to give the transmission to the next master and he tries to give him all these texts. But the transmission is alive, right? It's realization. It's dispositional. It's not propositional. And the famous story is remembered as what are you doing? What are you saying? Right? He gives them the documents, he throws them on the fire. The old master shouts, what are you doing? And the young master shouts, what are you saying? Right? That idea has how crystallizable is a living truth. Uh, and I'm the first to admit that I think that there's a mastery to catching that living truth and to flattening it out into words. I think it's actually a manifestation of a certain type of power that is why we go back to these ancient philosophers because they're still flexing their muscles through these linguistic achievements. But that living thing, this is part of the William James thing is to look at the actual experience, the lived experience, to use an overworked term. He's the guy that brought that to us. What does it do? Not what does it contain? How does it function? Right. So so I think, looking at that function, it isn't a what, it's a how. It isn't what are the good questions. It's what is the process and what is the mental space that I sit in that puts me in interaction in a interpretive feedback loop that doesn't have to be spoken. It's vibrational and based on history and knowing the people that are involved. How do I let that very hidden listening that's there motivate my speaking and my questioning, which is even a very special kind of speaking. In business, when management speaks to what do you call the ones that aren't management? What's the official politically correct term?
Labor?
Labor? Is that what they call it? We're still
I don't
doing
know.
that? Okay. Um, anyway, I don't want to get my terminology right. But so often,
Personnel.
yeah, often management has absolutely no clue about the listening. Everybody knows the speaking, right? Because that's kind of what's put out there, and that's what everything's pointing at. What font shall we choose when we put out our speaking, right? But you can't pick a font for a listening because it's just in the ether, right? It's meaning. It's not even meaning, it's pregnant meaning, right? It's like meaning that's waiting to manifest there. And it makes me think of Socrates, who said that he was a midwife for ideas, right? So the first question is you got to know what's in the oven here, right? Like to know how to midwife it. and that's kind of like a pulse reading thing. I would put it in my, analogical basket I would call pulse reading, which referring to the way a doctor reads the pulse, meaning that there's something hidden going on inside that we need to get some feedback from, or we're not really gonna be able to address it, right? And there is that hermeneutical interpretive feedback loop of question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. If I don't ask the right questions, I can't get the right answers. And so that's what I would point to is the part of the hill that's not in the sunlight, that's kinda hidden. And I would say that you're really after that listening that calls forth the speaking for which it is a listening. And that's a direct quote from Werner Erhard. Probably have to wash my mouth out with soap now after that, but, you know, I wanna there's questions about the way Werner was going about things, the whole deal, but he built his contraption out of a lot of good old-fashioned parts that he refashioned. Like, he has a whole thing about thrownness, which is a Heideggerian concept, but his thrownness is different than Heidegger's thrownness. And he took stuff from Muktananda, I think, so there's good pieces in there. It doesn't mean that, what was one of our episodes called? God made the food, but the devil made the cooks. Right? So, sometimes you can sort through things, you'll find a carrot, you'll find some things that are still nutritious, even if the cooking was maybe a little off. But that's why we need to have a discriminating palate, right? A discriminating intellectual palate. Um, but anyway, so that's a distinction that I think that is important, and that idea of a listening. Uh, and just I think that concept of identifying the listening and realizing that you're not speaking into an empty space, you're speaking into a listening, and it is every bit as it is the catcher's mitt to the pitcher's pitch of your speaking, right? Yeah, maybe stretching the analogy there, but you get the idea. There is a yin thing here nobody looks at. And if you look at it, then you're young. When you deal with the yang component, you'll have a more balanced, holistic, successful situation. So
Yeah.
there's my 2
Uh,
cents about that, my 44 cents about that.
you said something um, early on about listening being connected to the narratives we carry. I wonder if you want to double back to that.
Well, sure. I mean, I think that's what your whole project was about, was to there's this idea that within martial arts even, that yin goes first. So that a lot of the formal movements, they start with the left side moving out because it gets associated with passivity as opposed to the right side, which is activity. Or in certain mudras, we put the left side on top of the right side because the idea is that the passivity circuits will help to stabilize and um, harmonize the more active. If somebody's tuned to the active, this is a way to go move into the more balanced state. So there's this idea that yin always comes first. And one of the ways that translates is it means that yang doesn't just move into an empty space. There is that listening. There is that asking before one postulates. There is some gathering before there's a putting out. There's some inhale before an exhale. So we go, when you started speaking the very beginning of the question, there was this idea of narratives, and you say, well, speak the narratives. We're really working in another liminal space, right? Liminal, Lyman, Latin, threshold, place in between two places. Because the narratives that we know aren't that enlightening. Okay, you're a father. Okay, you're a truck driver. Okay, you're a boyfriend. Okay, you're whatever. It's the ones that we don't know that we're living out of, the undisclosed ones. Well, if we don't know, then we can't very well answer that question, right? So, in the asking the question, what we're hoping to do is we're hoping to snag on to something that's in that liminal space that we haven't yet latched onto, but it's latch onable because it's kind of splashing up on the shore. So maybe when the water goes back, like the plover, we can run out there and snag it, bring it up on land and see what WTH, or, and so that's kind of this idea of process of sort of mining to understand the narratives that we're living out of. And this is what sometimes ceremonies do. This is what sometimes typically therapy does. This is what life does if we live it with a certain degree of introspection. And this idea that life is lived forwards but understood backwards. Well, this is kind of that backward looking, um, NLP says we generalize, we delete, and we distort. And so, I fell off the rocking chair is one example they use. So now I go into a unconscious state of anxiety when I'm in a room with a rocking chair because the secret narrative I'm living out of is that rocking chairs are damn dangerous. And even though that was a truth when I was 4 and the accident happened, now I'm 44, but I'm still carrying that anxiety because this narrative is undisclosed. And it's like, yeah, yeah, I think there's a mechanism like that. And I think, though, that this is an element of developing self awareness. Um, why did I do that? You know, why did I want to do this other thing, but did that instead? Why did why did I interpret? That's the biggest one. Why did I interpret X, Y, or Z in such a fashion? Why? Because somehow when I took that piece and I held it up against my horizon, I guess is the Gadamer's term for it. I still think that's still too two-dimensional. So I want a whole multi-dimensional bucket that this all gets. And maybe the idea of horizon is that it's receding, and so there's always more. And I like that. That's good. But I've got this huge world of stored and distilled experience that now this new piece happened. Why did they say that? Why did they do that? Why? And I hold it up against all of that experience to try to get meaning from it. Well, a narrative as such is just like a practiced interpretive channel that has a sort of gravity of its own. This is like James talking about habit. You know, when you first started to tie your shoes, God, this thing's got to go under and you got to hand this thing off. Now you got to make a loop and you got to hold the loop and not lose it while you go under and you go off. It's like, oh, come on, right? But now look at how you do it. And he says, well, it used to take steps A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, you know, and now we know we just tell it to begin the sequence, and then we just attend to the end of the sequence, and we don't have to think our way all the way through each step. We use that mechanism in martial arts a lot, right? Like one of the ways I'll try to demonstrate this, you can do this. There's a fun one you can do at home. Go to someone stick your hand out like you would shake their hands. And then when they go, which they will on autopilot pretty much, even if you're not in a situation where ordinarily they would shake your hands, when you stick your hand out there, they've autopiloted this so much. They will stick their hand out to shake your hand, even though their conscious mind is going, what? Why are we shaking hands? Right. But then instead of shaking their hands, right before you shake their hands, grab their wrist with the other hand instead. Now what's happened is you've just stopped them in the middle of a programmed sequence. And they'll be stuck for a second because now they have to create their way out of it. Every other time in their life, someone stuck their hand out to shake their hands. They completed the operation, they shook, and it always ended the same way. But when you stick your hand out and grab it, their wrist with the other hand, that's never happened to them. I can almost guarantee it. Well, that means that they haven't preset a way like now this is a genuinely unique experience for them, and they're gonna have to create a neurological program to get out of it. And it'll usually be something like, "Huh? What? What?" And you'll see that there's, "Oh, yeah," right? Well, you translate that to martial arts, now you've uncovered the robotness of your opponent. So you know if I can catch him mid loop when he's off, on autopilot, if I can catch him when he's not home, I get away with whatever I want, right? Or I'll make him I can catch him halfway through where he's going, "What?" Yeah, yeah, and he's gotta create a pattern out, that takes way too long, right? So this is the mental, psychological, emotional equivalent of that. You got all this mental model of multidimensional bucket of experience metabolized and connected in all of its mystical ways, but somehow certain paths have become much more readily practiced. And so anything close, because we're sorting, like I said, we're in this maelstrom and we're just sorting stuff. And so we're going to sort some things in well worn pathways because of habit, neurological habit, right? Well, some of those things are narratives. Uh, those narratives can be every different kind of way. And I think that yeah, the flashlight is the first stage, asking the question, what are those narratives? And that's related to why do I always, or maybe more another level in is why do I always interpret? And then you fill that in. And yeah, like I say, from a martial arts standpoint, you don't want to be predictable, so you don't want to be triggerable. So you want as few reactions and as many conscious actions as possible, or safely trained, well, territory you've been over a lot. And I think there's a certain similarity here to that. That and this is under that topic of know thyself that goes all the way back to Plato's Academy, right? Or is it's the temple, uh, one of the temples in Greece, know thyself. Yeah.
Just a couple of reactions. Um, I I had the insight that I think you maybe already started with, but it wasn't on my mind before, that making these narratives visible at the beginning of the dialogue also gave everybody information about the quality of listening that they were going to experience in the dialogue, right? These narratives were part of the listening field that people were going to um, put themselves in. So
On
so I
top
had.
of on top of all of their prior experience of each individual person and how they presented and what
Mhm,
that energetic reaction was like. And then that becomes the latest piece in that part of their cognitive model of the other person. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's interesting. And then I was thinking about the self-reflection that it called for, um, also being the disruption that you were just referring to in the martial arts context, where when you pause and ask yourself, what narratives am I living right now, and what's the overarching one, if there is such a thing, or the most important one that might be less easy to access and speak than kind of the obvious ones, like, when you started out with I'm a father, or I'm a um, those are kind of like identity level and elements of a narrative. But the narratives that people were sharing were more like, I am thinking about what getting old means to me, and being an older woman in particular, and that I that the way I relate to that is different than the way my culture relates to it. And so I feel isolated in my own, um as I get more mature, I kind of am relating less to how my culture views maturity. And so, yeah, like that kind of thing. And that was a disruption to, like the pause and asking myself what is my experience it causes that um an automatic process like the handshake to get made conscious again, right? The automation that we do of so many things, if we could just slow that down and make some of those things less automatic, sometimes we couldn't survive if we eliminated automation in general, I think. But
Mhm.
if we could slow down sometimes and take a closer look, then that's an opportunity to level up.
Well, and I think that that is a chapter-based thing, and, in one of our prior episodes, I gave the 3 different curves. It was in the episode on, the what would you call them? Post-Freudians, hope, will, and purpose, and, that the story of your life sort of will set that context of how you embrace those chapters. And it's true that a lot of the issues that people have, psychological issues, happen because of an unsuccessful transition from one chapter to the next chapter. And I think that this is where uh what is this? Boethius and the Consolation of Philosophy? The idea of, one of the maybe this plugs in. One of the things I've been thinking about is 2 readings from the Tao Te Ching that seem kinda contradictory. And one is that nature is unkind and treats things and people like sacrificial straw dogs. And then the sage is unkind and treats things and people like sacrificial straw dogs. But then there's another passage where it says, uh, "I have 3 treasures. Guard them and keep them safe. And the greatest of these is love, for heaven arms with love those it would not see destroyed." So how do you sit in both of those places? How do you, uh this is related to the free will question. How do you act into that question, that polarity, that liminal space between those 2 worlds? And I think the answer is through will, and that living is the answer to free will. I think that's where William James ended up too. But yeah, because what happens is the ongoing process of aging is, I think, a process of more aloneness. But I think that aloneness has vast philosophical fecundity if it's translated correctly. So maybe that was uh, uh, a little ricochet rabbit, but you can see, I mean, there's some things going on there, and I think that we hold these narratives, but we don't hold them in a vacuum. We hold them through Heidegger's temporality, right? He calls it being towards death, and that we can't even live authentically unless we're living with that reality. And that is an ultimate aloneness. So, yeah, you are stepping away from culture. You're stepping away from everything as time goes on. Uh, and that's where you really see who's got sand in their belly and who doesn't. Viktor Frankl, look at people when they're in prison camps, and you'll see the same thing. Uh, he was talking about, uh, your whole world has collapsed. You're literally standing there naked. So none of the things that you have to dress you up, to say who you are present. Who you are is just who you are in this moment, making of this what you will, and will is the important word. Yeah. So, and what else comes up with this? Job, right? An answer to Job. The only damage that can really occur to us is to our souls. So that's tied up with that idea of will, purpose, hope, ultimately at the end of the track, wisdom, right? But there is and this is like the fruit falling from the tree, right? This is like that that liminal transition space that qualifies what life has been. And yeah, once you get old, that's what you have is the raw material to run the program on that you never had when you were in life because when you were in active life, when you were in life of the world, right? As opposed to, somebody said that at some point you cross a line where it's no longer just another day. Now it's one less day. So that contextualizes your philosophy in a very different way. And that's what that temporality, that's what that being towards death is that being towards death actually implies being beyond death. But that's a more complicated. We might need Federico Faggin and some of these physicists to explain how that
Mm.
happens. But uh,
I'm wondering when you were referring to these conflicting statements in the Tao Te Ching, um, can you say more about the emotion that came up for you in the second half of that conflict?
well, uh, yeah, that's the joke of the general at the expense of the particular.
Hmm.
But that's just one viewpoint, right? Because ultimately, the peelings of the onion are empty. And he
Hmm.
didn't mean what he'd said.
Hmm.
So that's that mystery. That's that,
Yeah,
uh,
the beautiful paradox.
yeah. And the moving to the
Yeah.
next dimension that solves the paradox of back and forth and back. But the joke of the general at the expense of the particular is from the seat of the particular. It's a joke. It's the universal sorrow. It's a joke only from the higher perspective, only
Hmm.
from transcension. But you can't transcend until you break away. And you can't break away until you've learned, right?
Mm.
That's shuhari. So this is just kind of an expansion of that principle, an expansion of that feedback loop, right? So
What's shuhari?
shuhari is a principle in the Japanese martial arts that explains the process that one goes through over decades. The shu is the learn, or sometimes it's translated, I think, as protect, which means don't deviate, don't mess up, keep the core. So you're in the learning phase, which means that you're not warping the lineage to your ego. Your ego is submitting to the lineage, and you're learning. But then once that lineage teaching has done its work on you, then you hit the ha section, which is break away, which means that somehow you have to own this. You have to go from the camel to the lion. You have to really, right? And that breaking away is a critical transition. But it's, how do I say it? It's still in this world. Ultimately, and I don't know how many make it to this stage, but ultimately that itself needs to dissolve. This is the second to last bull in the 10 bulls, the empty circle. Bull and self and path all transcended. And that's the final is transcension. So so yeah, there's this process there. And uh we are being philosophically prepared for the bigger picture through the process of aging, through those successive chapters.
There's kind of a peristaltic process there between part to whole to part in a way. Um, like being connected to the lineage and um, sublimating the ego, right, the self to the lineage, and then taking ownership. So that's a transition from being part of a lineage to being in relationship to the lineage, but being having individuated,
Not just
and
a
then
transition, a transformation.
transformation. And then having individuated, there's another transformation to transcending lineage, identity, ego, all of those things. And there's a merging in that. So there's kind of like
Exactly.
this, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, there's a whole yin yang yin thing going on there.
I
Hidden,
remain
manifest,
convinced.
hidden. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I was just going to say, I remain convinced that there's still, like your point earlier on about, um, maybe pay more attention to the yin than to the yang in terms of asking this question, and um and really it's the how of the asking, not the what is asked, and it's the how of the listening that is creating, to use the good word you just did, the fecundity of a dialogue session. But I also I also think that there was something special about asking about narratives because of the quality that because of a quality that narratives have, because they're fundamental, and they're maybe in this liminal space between conscious and unconscious, that they allow us to make our thinking visible to ourselves, and therefore um, contribute to making collective thought visible in a dialogue. Um, I don't know. Maybe I'm just attached.
Well, what they represent is the liminal space of logos, right? Uh, if we, and this is another thing that I've been squeezing out of Heidegger is sort of the difference. Okay, there's a philosophical difference when we say something ontically or we say something ontologically. Ontically has to do with its existence. Ontologically has to do with the meaning of its existence, not just the study of its existence as we typically translate ology, but that logos is a lot more charged up than that. To study it is to take meaning from it. And right there is to say that somehow substance and meaning are inextricably linked in such a way that we can unfold them ontologically. Okay, now this is kind of maybe seems like an obscure point, but what I'm pointing to is that language sits in that liminal space between us and our consciousness and the world outside. I've referred to the linguisticality of reality, that that somehow and this is a topic for debate amongst philosophers. Where does language live? Does it live in our head? No, it seems to live in reality. But is it a fundamental aspect of reality? And this is the mind body problem, because meaning has to live in mind, right? And stuff is bodies. And so once again we come up on the mind body thing. And so so language is in that liminal space, and narrative is always an attempt to interpret the interaction between the self and the world, right? Without the subject and the object, there's no interpretive. There's no, and language is the bridge that happens through. And that's why, just in the education of people, I am always like language, 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 language. Most important thing that's gonna have enough influence on how your future is gonna work out. Language, 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 language. It's ridiculously important. It's like, how many paints are there in your paint set? And then if you really get good with language, you can make new colors with them, right? So so, yeah, so language is quite unique in that way, and it serves a purpose. And it also, Lao Tzu has this interesting thing where he says the five colors blind the eye. And what he means by that is that if we're used to seeing things with those distinctions, we stop losing, we start sorting all experience into those distinctions.
It's the
So
same automation we were talking about earlier.
exactly.
The handshake.
And this is one of the things James talks about in his first principles of psychology is the automaton theory, which is the thing that sunk him in his emotional hole, that if everything's just, levers and cables and it's all just mechanical and it's all just determined, why get out of bed? You know? And that became quite a problem for him, and quite a philosophical problem as well as a psychological problem. Yeah. But so um yeah, language has this unique role, and that's why we wanna be careful with it, we wanna be conscious of it, we wanna understand what rides in on it. Like my friend I mentioned before wrote a song called Word Dance, and in this song, he talks about there are the words and there's the dance behind them. Well, that's almost like the unseen part of the speaking, right? We have the listening on the part of the other person, which is unseen, but there's also the dance behind the words, which we're very good at picking up on, but we're not always good on making them conscious and working on them knowledgeably. We just maybe walk away with a weird feeling because something wasn't, so yeah, there's a lot of unseen stuff, and I think that language is one of the things that helps us sieve out the unseen things to point to them. And that's a big interpretive role. So yeah, it goes all the way to Gadamer finally, I think, arguing that any action you take is really an interpretation. So understanding the mechanism of our interpretation, that's why I'm always hammering on hermeneutics, hammering on using your life experience to give you a broader base from which to interpret. And uh so narratives that we live out of, that when they don't serve us, then that's I was thinking maybe a good name for this episode would be I Robot, because that's kind of when narratives no longer serve us, then what they've done is they've roboticized us. And I say that because in martial arts, we used to talk about robot karate. And one of the things is very easy. It's predictive, right? It's predictable. And so the one thing you don't want to be is a robot. And I think that on a lot of, because of the complexity of life and because of the intensity of the downloads of narratives, we often go into a very passive mode around that. And this is one of the reasons again why why I encourage people to, I mean, it should be considered more than an encouragement, why I regularly rant about the importance of the dispositional condition that being in nature engenders. Not the obvious stuff, the inobvious stuff. Well, I think part of that is it loosens it changes the context, and the context can shake loose some of those narratives, redefining, you know. So why Outward Bound is so good for kids, because I think when kids are in that age group where this is so impactful, they're really suffering from some impoverished narratives, and that somehow this just resets the whole thing. Just, you know, just resets all the parameters, sets it in a whole new setting, and so everything's different, you know?
Makes me think about, um,
It's almost cheating.
how baked in narratives are relatively at different stages of life. And I imagine in our late teens, when we're coming up on individuation, really, I wouldn't say for the first time, but it's important in a way it hadn't been previously. And you've got, 15, 18, 20 years of narratives that are to a large extent imposed. Individuation means claiming narrative for the first time, and it's not really the first time. I mean, we create our own narratives in various ways prior, but we don't have to survive based on the quality of our narratives when we're young the way we do when we first have to make our own way in the world, in our late teens, early 20s. And so there's a special quality of disrupting narratives that happens at that time. I wanted to close the episode though with something else because when um, you were talking about the Tao Te Ching earlier and this paradox. It reminded me that a couple of days ago, I was listening to Box of Rain by the Grateful Dead. And
Song,
um,
actually.
it's a good song and a heavy song. And when the last line came on, and I was kind of humming along, such a long, long time to be gone and a short time to be there. I welled up with tears. I had no idea why, but I think it was kind of the same thing. So
Yep,
today's
yep.
rock and roll reference, um, and uh, for I didn't know what it meant. I've been listening to that song for I don't know 30 years, um, off and on, not straight
Yeah,
through.
the whole time, yeah,
Um,
that's good. That would be a
yeah,
red light.
yeah, on the meter, yeah. But, I didn't really know what it meant, but the kind of symbolism of it or the archetypal meaning of it always captivated me, but I know what it means now. And, and, uh, and that welling up of emotion I had wasn't just about the familiarity. There was like this 30 years of kind of that last line being lodged in my head to some extent, but there's
Mhm.
also this like, you know, I'm past the 50 mark, and, it is a short time to be there.
Yep, it is,
Yeah,
it is. Amor fati, right?
yeah,
And,
yeah.
uh, what's the word? A memento mori,
Mhm.
Latin for today, and, uh but yeah, I mean, it's hard to see maybe from certain seats, but there is a creative potential in that, that is the same when an artist picks a, like you can see behind me, this painting here, I knew that this was the shape that I wanted, but I didn't have the painting inside of it, and the space defined how the painting filled it, so to speak. And so it's like, okay, well, there's life, right? If it was if it was infinite, none of this would have meaning, right? You see that I'm referring over my head for people that are listening on Spotify. There's a painting on the wall behind me, and so the confines are really the thing. There's a section where in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, when he's assigning a writing assignment, and he tells the kid, write about it. Well, just write about one building, write about just the front of that building. I still can't. Well, write about one brick of one part of one building of one, So framing things in actually provides the context within which meaning can happen.
Wendell Berry has a great essay called, I think it was called Faustian Economics, that he published in Harper's probably also 20 or 30 years ago. That's about how constraints are the only thing that make meaning, and art is lumped in with meaning possible, right? And he talks about farming and cooking a meal with the ingredients that you have as a constraint, and he talks about painting with the the ends of the canvas, the dimensions of the canvas being the constraints that you have, and and that art would not be possible without that. Yeah, I think that's a important idea. Um, there's also I want to say that that welling up is loving life. That what comes up with memento mori, it I I I translate it as love.
And understanding the nature of transcension, the bittersweet symphony, another rock and roll reference for you. Uh, yeah, yeah. But it's that same thing. It's the framing, contextualizing, giving meaning, giving the shape to the
Hmm.
meaning. Yeah. I
Uh-huh.
mean, and if you imagine this painting, but it was on a big square piece, it wouldn't be the same painting at all. Same, the image part could be identical, but just that changing the context changes the feel. It changes the je ne sais pas, right? So the I don't know what.
Cool. Yeah.
Very good. Well, I think that's
Good.
a
Well, it's great to see you, Brian. Thank you.
good to see you also. Onward through the fog.